The grand dining hall of the Zraxian Hegemony was an architectural marvel designed for one purpose: intimidation. High Ambassador Krell sat at the head of the obsidian table, his primary mandibles clicking with a rhythmic, predatory satisfaction. Across from him sat Daniel Foster, a middle-aged human in a simple gray suit, carrying nothing but a data tablet and an infuriatingly pleasant smile. To the Zraxians, Foster was a Grade D primitive, a mere agricultural consultant from a backwater planet. They had watched humanity for decades, noting how they apologized when stepped on and mediated disputes with endless, boring treaties. The hegemony had decided it was time to remove this diplomatic nuisance discreetly. "Ambassador Foster," Krell's translator crackled, dripping with a patronizing tone. "To celebrate our new trade agreement, we have prepared a delicacy from the Xylos system. It is called the Shimmer-Root. For most species, its essence is transformative. Transformative was an understatement. To 98% of known galactic life, Shimmer-Root was a neurotoxin so potent that a single microgram could paralyze a Zraxian warrior in seconds. The Zraxians had laced Foster's portion with enough of the toxin to stop a planetary defense corps. Foster picked up his utensil with the practiced grace of a species that had spent millions of years perfecting the art of table manners. He took a large, deliberate bite. Krell and his council leaned forward, their optical sensors widening in anticipation of the humans' inevitable collapse. Instead, Foster's eyes lit up. He chewed slowly, a look of genuine appreciation crossing his face. "Oh, that has quite a kick," Foster said, dabbing his mouth with a silk napkin. "It reminds me of a pepper we grow back on Earth called the Carolina Reaper. It has that same wonderful stinging sensation at the back of the throat. Is that capsaicin? Or perhaps a localized sulfuric acid base?" The silence that followed could have suffocated a star. Krell's feeding tentacles went rigid. The human wasn't dying. He wasn't even sweating. He was enjoying a substance that was classified as a Class 7 biohazard by the Galactic Council. "You find the sensation pleasant?" Krell managed to ask, his translator static heavy with disbelief. "Incredibly," Foster replied, reaching for his water glass, which, unknown to him, had been spiked with a heavy metal solvent. "We humans often ingest mild poisons for recreation. It's part of the charm of coming from a Class 12 Deathworld. Our biology is quite stubborn." Foster took a long sip of the spiked water, let out a satisfied sigh, and looked Krell directly in his central eye. The smile was still there, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. "But I must say, Ambassador," Foster continued softly, leaning forward, "if this is your idea of a welcome, I'm curious to see what you serve for the main course. Because if the hospitality doesn't improve, I might actually start getting annoyed." Krell felt his secondary heart skip a beat. He had read the reports on the Annoyance Protocol, but he had dismissed them as mass hysteria. Now, looking at the human who had just consumed a lethal dose of neurotoxin with a smile, he realized the galaxy had made a catastrophic mistake. The humans weren't being polite because they were weak. They were being polite because it was the only thing keeping their nature in check. The Zraxian High Council sat in petrified silence as Daniel Foster reached for a second helping of the Shimmer-Root. To the Zraxians, the root was a concentrated neurotoxin, but to Foster it was merely an exotic appetizer with a wonderful, stinging sensation. Ambassador Krell watched with all four optical stalks as the human gestured toward a platter of void berries, fruit that pulsated with a rhythmic, bioluminescent glow. These berries were so acidic they were used by the Zraxian military to etch starship hulls, yet the human popped one into his mouth with the casual ease of a man eating a grape. In the observation gallery, the Zraxian Science Division was frantically rescanning Foster's vitals. Their sensors, designed to track the biological collapse of lesser species, were returning data that defied their fundamental understanding of medicine. Foster's heart rate remained steady. His toxin absorption levels were functioning with the efficiency of a high-grade filtration system, and his metabolism was converting the biological weapons into pure caloric energy. He didn't look like a man dying. He looked like a predator who had just finished a light snack. "Back on Earth, we have a long history of consuming things that should, by all rights, kill us," Foster remarked conversationally, dabbing a drop of glowing juice from his lip. He explained that humans evolved on a planet where plants developed poisons, specifically to stop them from being eaten, and the humans simply responded by deciding those poisons were delicious. Ambassador Krell felt his mandibles trembling as he recognized the shift in the room. He recalled the classified files on human stages, the warning that humans were a species of extreme patience until a specific threshold was crossed. Foster had already mentioned he was starting to notice the lack of true hospitality, a clear indicator that the diplomatic mask was beginning to slip. Krell signaled the waiters to bring out the Leviathan's heart, a radioactive organ from a deep-sea predator that was intended to be the final, undeniable end for the human guest. When the steaming, glowing meat was placed before him, Foster didn't flinch. Instead, he pulled a small silver bottle from his pocket, containing a thick red liquid he called hot sauce, claiming it helped clear the sinuses. The fumes alone caused the nearest Zraxian guard to sway, but Foster took a massive bite, chewed thoughtfully, and smiled. It was that unsettling human smile. The one that showed far too many teeth and didn't reach his eyes at all. Foster set his utensil down with a sharp, metallic click that echoed through the silent hall. His voice dropped an octave, becoming suddenly cold and focused as he looked Krell directly in his central eye. He told the ambassador that they were done with the games, and he admitted he knew they had spent the last hour trying to kill him with the menu. Krell realized then that Foster wasn't just an agricultural consultant. He was a man who understood violence intimately but chose to use table manners instead. The human leaned forward, his hands folded on the table in a gesture that suggested he was now the one in control of the session. He informed the council that he was no longer interested in the food, but he was very interested in the 3 human colony ships the Hegemony had been monitoring near the border. Just as Krell opened his mandibles to offer a frantic lie, the station's internal sensors shrieked a high-priority alert. A fleet of 23 human warships had just dropped out of faster-than-light travel, directly above the Zraxian palace, their weapons hot and their targeting systems locked onto the council chamber. Daniel Foster checked his watch, the pleasant smile returning to his face, though his eyes remained as cold as a void. He told the ambassador that his varsity team was early, and he suggested it was time to discuss the trade agreement again, this time with the humans setting the price. The air in the grand dining hall, once thick with the scent of expensive toxins, now crackled with a different kind of ozone, the type generated by high-output targeting sensors locking onto a palace's structural weak points. Ambassador Krell's optical stalks retracted and extended in a frantic, rhythmic blur, a physical manifestation of a species that had just realized they were no longer the hunters, but the specimen. Foster didn't look up from the radioactive Leviathan's heart. He sliced another piece of the glowing meat, dipped it in his ghost pepper sauce, and chewed with the focused intensity of someone who considered a galactic incident a mere distraction from a good meal. "You see, Krell," Foster began, his voice cutting through the wailing of the palace's emergency sirens with terrifying clarity. "The problem with your species is that you mistake patience for weakness. You saw us smiling, negotiating, and writing treaties in 12 different languages, and you thought we were prey pretending to be predators. But on Earth, we have a specific hunting technique many of our apex predators use. They stay very still. They don't charge. They wait until the prey is comfortable." He set his fork down, and the metallic clink sounded like a hammer on a coffin lid. Foster explained that the 23 warships outside weren't just for show. They were led by Admiral Elizabeth Morrison, a woman who considered the creative disassembly of hostile vessels a specialty. He revealed that the human government had known about the lethal menu 3 weeks before his arrival. Their economists had run the numbers and realized the Hegemony had spent more on the neurotoxins for this dinner than they would have on the actual trade agreement. "At this exact moment, your planetary defense grid has been neutralized by a coordinated cyber attack," Foster continued, his voice devoid of heat. "It took us approximately 46 seconds. Krell's mandibles clicked a desperate, static-filled plea, claiming this was an act of war and a violation of diplomatic accords. Foster laughed, a short, sharp sound that lacked any warmth. He told the ambassador that this wasn't war but a performance review, and that his colleagues were currently grading the Zraxian security protocols. Foster stood up, the chair scraping against the obsidian floor. The pleasant mask he'd worn for the first course was gone, replaced by the stare of a species that had spent millions of years being hunted by things bigger and meaner than them. "I told you I was getting annoyed," Foster said, leaning across the table until he was inches from Krell's face. "And when a human gets annoyed, we stop being diplomats and start being efficient. My varsity team is currently deciding whether to glass this palace or just rename it Earth Colony 14. Krell shrieked, his feeding tentacles curling in terror as he promised to return the colony ships immediately and pay reparations. Foster reached into his pocket, pulled out a data tablet, and slid it across the table into a puddle of neurotoxin-laced juice. He informed the ambassador that the new terms were mathematically solid, undeniably fair, and non-negotiable. Krell had 10 minutes to sign before Foster stopped being annoyed and became the reason the Zraxian species became a cautionary tale. Foster turned his back on the ambassador, walking toward the grand windows to watch the human fleet paint the sky with targeting lasers. Behind him, Krell's trembling claws reached for the tablet. Foster called over his shoulder, suggesting that next time the ambassador should try the ghost pepper sauce, as it added life to a dead situation. Krell realized that if he didn't sign, the next human the Zraxians met wouldn't be carrying a tablet, but a planet cracker. Foster stood motionless by the window, his silhouette outlined by the glowing trails of human dropships descending toward the Zraxian capital. High Ambassador Krell looked down at the data tablet, his multiple eyes struggling to focus on the scrolling text that outlined the systematic dismantling of his empire's economic sovereignty. The terms were simple and absolute: the immediate return of all abducted colony ships, the permanent restoration of New Perth to its original inhabitants, and a full audit of the hegemony's military budget by human oversight committees. Krell's secondary feeding tentacles twitched as he realized that Foster had played him perfectly, using the diplomatic dinner as a facade to map the palace's internal social dynamics and security blind spots. The human had not just survived the neurotoxins, he had used the Zraxian arrogance against them, letting them believe he was a grade D target until his own varsity team was in position to strike. Foster noted that while he preferred the economist's approach of shared resource management, the hegemony had forced the admiral's approach of total tactical compliance. One of the elite Zraxian guards, a 4-meter-tall behemoth with an exoskeleton rated for heavy orbital fire, suddenly lunged forward. He aimed to crush the human with his primary mandibles rather than draw a weapon. Foster did not even turn around. In a blur of movement that would later be categorized by the Council as the 14.3-second response standard, Foster sidestepped the lunge with the eerie grace of an apex predator. He did not strike back with violence. Instead, he caught the guard's wrist at a precise angle and applied a localized torque that sent the massive alien crashing into the obsidian table. "That is a very predictable frontal assault, Commander," Foster said, finally turning to look at Krell as the guard groaned on the floor. "Your tactical doctrine relies on overwhelming force, but you have forgotten that humans evolved on a planet where everything is faster, meaner, and twice as persistent as you are." Krell signed the tablet with a trembling claw, effectively surrendering the hegemony's military independence to a species that had only discovered fire when the Zraxians were already spacefaring. The human checked his chronometer and noted that they were currently sitting at Stage 4 of the Annoyance Protocol. Just as Krell handed the tablet back, the grand chamber doors hissed open, and Captain Elizabeth Morrison of the Terran Defense Fleet stepped inside, followed by a security detail that radiated controlled danger. She did not look at Foster. Her eyes were locked on Krell with an expression that suggested she was already calculating the most creative way to disassemble the palace. "The colony ships are secure," Morrison reported, her voice as hard as compressed neutronium. She informed the room that the human fleet had successfully bypassed the Zraxian encryption and accessed their deepest archives. However, there was a complication. The fleet had discovered the Vault, a localized spatial anomaly hidden beneath the palace where the Zraxians had been storing biological cargo that was not listed on any manifest. Krell's scales turned a deathly shade of gray as he realized the humans had found the one secret the hegemony was willing to burn the galaxy to protect. Krell collapsed into his chair, his feeding tentacles limp with the kind of existential dread that only comes from being caught in a billion-credit lie. Foster stood over him, the polite diplomatic mask discarded like a piece of refuse. He remarked that humanity had spent centuries learning to negotiate with things that had no voices, only hunger, and that the Zraxians had made the mistake of assuming the predators with table manners wouldn't look into the dark places of the hegemony. Morrison signaled her team to descend toward the sublevels, her face a mask of clinical military precision. As they moved through the corridors, the air grew cold, the atmospheric scrubbers struggling to mask a scent that Foster recognized from Earth's own ancient history. The smell of stagnant water and old, unyielding rage. Foster told Krell that humans were apex predators not because of armor or venom, but through pure terrifying persistence and a refusal to stay dead. They reached the heavy doors of the vault, which were reinforced with alloys Foster recognized as stolen human technology, designed to withstand the equivalent of a supernova. Morrison's technical specialist, a veteran who moved with the confidence of the Proxima conflict, bypassed the Zraxian locks in seconds. When the doors hissed open, the light from the human tactical lamps revealed rows of containment units. But they weren't holding mineral wealth or trade secrets. Inside the units were biological specimens from half a dozen worlds, species that the Zraxians had deemed primitive enough to exploit as labor or experimental subjects. However, at the center of the chamber sat a single massive cage that pulsed with a rhythmic, low-frequency hum that vibrated in Foster's very bones, triggering a sense of primal fear. Morrison stopped mid-step, her hand hovering over her sidearm. She whispered that the energy signature coming from the central cage wasn't Zraxian, and it wasn't a specimen from any known civilized system. Krell shrieked that they hadn't known what it was, only that they had found it buried in a Deathworld fault zone, and thought it could be weaponized to ensure hegemony dominance. Foster stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he recognized the faint, glowing symbols etched into the cage's base, symbols that predated human spaceflight by thousands of years. He realized the Zraxians hadn't just kidnapped colony ships. They had accidentally unearthed one of the nightmares humanity had spent millennia trying to keep asleep. The entity inside the cage suddenly opened an eye, a fusion of bioluminescence and ancient intelligence that locked onto Foster. It didn't roar, it simply waited, its presence unmaking the reality of the room until the Zraxian guards began to tremble. Foster turned to Krell, his voice barely a whisper but echoing like a death sentence. He informed the ambassador that the Zraxians had officially crossed the line from being annoying to being catastrophically dangerous to the galaxy's survival. Suddenly, the symbols on the cage flashed a blinding white, and the low hum escalated into a roar that shattered the surrounding containment glass. The roar that erupted from the central cage was not a sound transmitted through the air, but a psychic shockwave that vibrated through the marrow of everyone present. High Ambassador Krell was already on the floor, his multiple limbs tangled in a display of pure ancestral terror, while his elite guards had dropped their weapons, their nervous systems overwhelmed by a predator-prey response they couldn't control. Only Daniel Foster and Captain Morrison remained upright, though the color had drained from Foster's face, leaving him looking older and far more dangerous than he had during the dinner. The creature emerging from the shattered glass was a nightmare of shifting geometry and bioluminescence, a relic from a time when the galaxy was young and much more violent. It didn't have a fixed shape. It was a mass of obsidian scales, flickering eyes and limbs that seemed to move through the air as if it were water. Foster recognized the energy signature immediately from the classified archives of the Void-Stalkers, a species that humanity's ancestors had encountered and barely survived during their first tentative steps into the deeper Orion Arm. Humanity hadn't killed them. They had spent centuries building the very containment tech the Zraxians had just broken, hoping the galaxy would never have to see them again. Foster stepped toward the creature, ignoring the way the floor tiles began to frost over in its presence. He didn't draw a weapon, which caused the creature to tilt its massive, multi-eyed head in a gesture of eerie curiosity. He looked back at Krell and told him that the hegemony hadn't found a weapon or a specimen, but had instead unsealed a godslayer that fed on the bioelectrical energy of sentient life. He explained that the Zraxians' arrogance had led them to believe they could cage the wind, and now the entire station was essentially a dinner plate for an entity that didn't understand the concept of mercy. Captain Morrison signaled her team to form a defensive perimeter, but Foster held up a hand to stop them. He informed her that kinetic rounds and plasma would only feed the creature's mass, and that they needed to initiate the Cold Iron Protocol, a theoretical containment theory developed by human scientists who specialized in metaphysical engineering. Foster pulled a small, unassuming device from his pocket, a relic he had carried just in case the diplomacy failed. It was a localized gravity well stabilizer, designed to pin the entity's physical form to a single point in space-time. The creature lunged, a blur of shadow and teeth that moved faster than the Zraxian sensors could track. Foster didn't flinch. He waited until the last possible microsecond, his eyes locked onto the entity's central core. As the creature's claw reached for his throat, Foster activated the device. A hum deeper than the roar filled the room, and the air itself seemed to solidify into a translucent amber. The entity was caught mid-strike, frozen in a localized stasis field that began to glow with a fierce white light. Foster's hand was shaking from the strain of holding the stabilizer, and he shouted to Morrison that the field would only hold for 3 minutes. Krell looked up from the floor, his optical stalks twitching, as he realized the human was literally holding back a galactic extinction event with a handheld gadget. Foster didn't look back. He was focused entirely on the entity, which was already beginning to vibrate against the stasis field, its eyes turning a deep, angry red. He told Morrison to evacuate the Zraxians and the specimens, because he was about to do something that would make the previous Annoyance Protocol look like a polite suggestion. He informed her that if the field broke, he was authorized to trigger the station's self-destruct, and he didn't plan on being the only thing left in the room when it happened. The amber stasis field groaned, the sound of reality being stretched to its breaking point, echoing through the silent, frost-covered vault. Daniel Foster stood alone before the captured nightmare, his hand white-knuckled around the gravity stabilizer. In the distance, he could hear the heavy thud of human dropships lifting off, carrying the terrified Zraxian Council and the freed specimens to the safety of the orbiting fleet. Captain Morrison had argued to stay, but Foster had given her a specific look. The look of a man who was about to perform a very dangerous piece of scheduled maintenance, and didn't want any witnesses. The Void-Stalker's many eyes focused on Foster, and the human felt a cold, oily pressure sliding against the barriers of his mind. The entity wasn't just hungry for flesh. It fed on the conceptual weight of a species, consuming their memories, their history, and their collective will to exist. It reached into Foster's psyche, looking for the soft, easy fears of a grade D primitive. It expected to find the terror of a creature that knew it was about to be erased from the universe. Instead, the entity recoiled. Inside Foster's mind, it didn't find a garden of peaceful thoughts, but a landscape forged in the fires of a Class 12 Deathworld. It found the back row of human history, a chaotic, unyielding record of a species that had spent its entire existence surviving things that should have killed them. It saw the plagues, the world wars, the famine, and the cold, mathematical certainty of a people who had learned to weaponize their own suffering. Foster didn't try to push the entity out. He opened the door and invited it in, flooding the predator's senses with the sheer, overwhelming annoyance of 4 billion years of biological struggle. "You're looking for a meal," Foster whispered, his voice steady even as the floor beneath him began to liquefy into shadow. "But humans are a very particular kind of toxic. We don't just survive, we endure until the universe itself gets tired of trying to get rid of us. You think you're an extinction event? On Earth, we call that a Tuesday." The stabilizer in his hand flared a brilliant, blinding crimson as the 3-minute timer hit 0. The amber field shattered into 1,000 shards of frozen light. The Void-Stalker lunged, its obsidian form expanding to fill the entire vault, its maw opening to swallow the light itself. Foster didn't run. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit and pulled out a second device, a small, lead-shielded canister marked with a Terran Federation seal that Krell had never been allowed to see. It was a phase-shift inverter, a tool designed to synchronize the frequency of a target with the background radiation of the void. If it worked, it would blink the entity out of existence. If it failed, it would turn the entire palace into a localized black hole. Foster looked the Godslayer in its central eye, a thin, cold smile playing on his lips. He told the creature that it was about to learn the final lesson of the Annoyance Protocol. When a human is truly finished with a problem, they don't just solve it. They make sure it never existed in the first place. He thumbed the ignition. A silence more profound than death slammed into the room. For a heartbeat, Foster felt himself being pulled apart, his molecules vibrating at the speed of a dying star. Then, a pulse of white-hot energy erupted from the canister, turning the vault into a vacuum of pure, cleansing light. Outside on the palace balcony, Captain Morrison shielded her eyes as a pillar of white fire shot through the roof of the sublevels, punching a hole through the Zraxian sky. When the light faded, the vault was empty. The frost was gone, the shadows had retreated, and the ancient cage was nothing but a pile of fine gray ash. Foster was slumped against the far wall, his suit scorched and his glasses cracked, but he was still breathing. He looked up as Morrison's tactical team burst through the ruins, their weapons raised. He didn't look like a diplomat anymore. He looked like a man who had stared into the abyss and told it to move out of his way. "Is it gone?" Morrison asked, her voice hushed with awe. Foster wiped a smear of soot from his forehead and checked his watch. He stood up slowly, his movements stiff but purposeful. He looked at the spot where the Godslayer had been and told her that the problem had been successfully moved to a different coordinate in space-time, one where there was nothing to eat but cold, empty vacuum. He then turned toward the exit, informing the captain that he was officially resigning from his position as an agricultural consultant. Just as they reached the elevator, a low, rhythmic thumping began to vibrate through the floorboards. Not from the vault, but from the deep space communication array on the roof. Morrison checked her scanner, her face turning pale. She whispered that the Void-Stalker wasn't a solitary predator. The signal they had just detected wasn't a roar. It was a response. Somewhere in the deep dark between the stars, something much larger had heard the humans' annoyance. And it was coming to see who had dared to silence its kin. The terminal on the roof of the Zraxian palace shrieked with a signal that didn't belong to this dimension. Far above the atmosphere, the human fleet had formed a tight, defensive sphere, their railguns glowing with a pre-charged hum. Captain Morrison's voice crackled over Foster's comlink, her tone sharpened by the kind of adrenaline that only comes from staring at a god. She informed him that the Echo was massive. Not a single entity, but a collective consciousness that occupied the space between galaxies. It had detected the localized erasure of its scout, and it was moving toward the Zraxian system at a speed that defied the laws of physics. Foster stood in the center of the ruined vault, the phase shift inverter still smoking in his hand. He didn't look at the sky, he looked at Ambassador Krell, who was weeping in a way that involved far too many secretions. Foster grabbed the Zraxian by his primary vestment and hauled him toward the communication array. He told the ambassador that they had exactly 40 seconds to change the broadcast signature of the entire planet. He explained that the entity wasn't coming for revenge because a being that old didn't understand human emotions. It was coming to investigate a calorie source that had successfully fought back. "If we fight it, we die," Foster said, his voice cold and clinical. "If we hide, it will find us. We have to make this system look like the most frustrating, indigestible, and annoying place in the universe." He began typing into the Zraxian terminal with a speed that blurred his fingers, bypassing their encryption with the back row codes his team had mapped during the soup course. He wasn't uploading a weapon or a virus. He was uploading the entirety of Earth's bureaucracy, the tax codes of 300 nations, the infinite loops of automated customer service lines, and the collective frustration of every human who had ever been put on hold. As the shadow of the Echo touched the edge of the solar system, Foster hit the broadcast button. The Zraxian array didn't fire a beam of energy. It projected a psychic field of pure, concentrated human boredom. It was the Annoyance Protocol scaled to a planetary level. The entity, a being of pure thought and ancient hunger, suddenly found itself assaulted by the concept of waiting in line for a form that doesn't exist. It tried to process the contradictions of human logic, the way they could be terrified and bored at the exact same moment. And its vast, ancient mind shuddered under the weight of a species that had perfected the art of being a nuisance. For 10 agonizing minutes, the stars seemed to flicker and fade. Then, as quickly as it had arrived, the pressure vanished. The Echo didn't retreat, it simply turned away, deciding that the Zraxian system was a biological anomaly, not worth the energy required to consume it. The human fleet held their breath as the massive spatial distortion faded back into the void. Foster slumped against the terminal, his heart hammering against his ribs, and let out a long, shaky breath. He looked at Krell, whose optical stalks were still shaking, and told him that the diplomatic incident was officially over. In the aftermath, the hegemony was not dismantled by force. It didn't need to be. The Zraxian Council, having seen the janitors of the galaxy stare down a primordial deity using nothing but a spreadsheet and a headache, signed every trade agreement Foster put in front of them. They didn't do it because they loved humanity, but because they were now terrified of what humans did when they weren't being polite. The colony ships were returned, the reparations were paid, and Earth was granted a permanent seat on the Inner Council, in the back row, exactly where they wanted to be. Months later, Daniel Foster sat in a small cafe in New Perth, watching the sunset over the restored landscape. A young Zraxian diplomat approached him, bowing low and offering a gift of non-toxic tea. The diplomat asked how the humans had known the Echo would leave, and if they were truly the most dangerous species in the galaxy. Foster took a sip of the tea, found it slightly too sweet, and adjusted his glasses. He smiled that thin-lipped, patient smile and told the diplomat that humans weren't dangerous because they were strong, but because they were the only species that knew how to make being a predator look like a lot of paperwork. The Zraxian nodded, scribbling the wisdom into his data tablet, and hurried away to report back to the hegemony. Foster watched him go, then leaned back and opened a new file on his tablet. The title read, Sector 9, Theoretical Annoyances and Resource Management. Somewhere in the distance, the human fleet was already moving toward the next summit, their warships painted with the logos of agricultural development companies. The galaxy was finally learning the lesson that Krell had learned over dinner. You can threaten a human's life, and they will negotiate. But if you waste their time, they will rewrite the laws of reality just to make you leave them alone.